We've talked about adding integers. Now we're going to talk about subtracting integers. And it can get a little bit tricky with subtraction because you get subtraction signs in there, you get negative signs in there, we're mixing it all together, and it can get tough, but we really want to think about what we know about adding and subtracting positive integers and apply that to the more complicated problems. So let's first look at the basics. Positive minus a positive. So if we've got something like 3 minus 2. Basic subtraction that we've been doing for a long time here, but let's look at it on the number line. So if I'm at positive, oopsies, not from there, at positive 3, and I subtract positive 2. Well, when I add a positive, I move to the right. I'm subtracting a positive, so I'm moving to the left, which brings me to 1. So subtracting a positive, you move to the left. So now let's look at if we have a positive minus a negative. So if we start with 5 minus negative 2. So if we have positive 5 is where we are starting. We are subtracting a negative. So in the first problem we were subtracting a positive and we move to the left. Well, we're doing the opposite. We're subtracting a negative. So instead of moving to the left, we're actually going to move to the right and we're going to land at positive 7. So let's look at a couple more examples because that can be kind of tricky to think about. So number 3, 4 minus negative 7. So we're going to start at positive 4 and we are subtracting a negative. So when you subtract a positive, we go to the left. We're subtracting a negative, which is in the opposite direction. We go to the right. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's not really space for it, but it lands at positive 11. Number 4. We've got 2 minus negative 4. So we start at 2 on the number line, which is right here. When we subtract a positive, we go to the left. We're subtracting a negative, so I'm going 4 to the right. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that lands me at positive 6. So let's think about this. How do we get to these numbers without using a number line? If I think about this, if I've got 5 and 2, how am I going to get to 7? Well, that's really like doing the same thing as adding them together to get to 7. 4 and 7, how do I get to the 11? It's kind of like adding those absolute values there. 2 and 4, how do I get to 6? Well, if I look at those absolute values and I add those, I'm going to get to 6. So if we kind of think about this, subtracting a negative is really the same thing as adding a positive. Now we want to look at a negative minus a negative. So we did positive minus a negative. Let's look at negative minus a negative. First problem, we've got negative 5 minus negative 2. So I'm starting at negative 5 on the number line. Same thing, when I subtract a positive, we go to the left, but I'm subtracting a negative, so that's the opposite. I'm going to go to the right 2, which lands me at negative 3. Number 6, negative 7 minus negative 3. So we're starting at negative 7. When I subtract a positive, I go to the left. I'm subtracting a negative, so I'm going to the right 3, which lands me at negative 4. And last one, negative 8 minus negative 10. So we start at negative 8. When I subtract a positive, I go to the left. I'm subtracting a negative, so I'm going to go to the right 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And that lands me at a positive 2. So we've got some negatives and some positive answers. So let's think about this. How am I going to get 3? I'm ignoring the negatives or positives. How do I get 3 from 5 and 2? Am I adding or am I subtracting? Well, if I subtract 5 and 2, it'll get me to 3. But why is it negative? Well, we just talked about in the last problem that really subtracting a negative is kind of the same thing as adding a positive. So if I look at this, I've got 5 negatives and I've got 2 positives, which means I have more negatives than positives. Over here, how do I get to 4 from 7 and 3? Am I going to add 7 and 3 or am I going to subtract? I subtract, which would give me 4. But again, why is it negative? Well, up here we said subtracting a negative is kind of the same thing as adding a positive. So I've got 7 negatives and 3 positives. I've got more negatives than positives, so I have a negative result. For this guy, how do I get to 2? Do I add 8 and 2 or do I find the difference? Well, if I add, I'm going to get 18, so I'm going to find the difference. But remember, we always take the bigger absolute value when finding the difference. So I'm going to do 10 minus 8, which gives me 2. Well, how is it positive? Same idea as up here. Subtracting a negative is the same thing as adding a positive. So I've got 8 negatives, I've got 10 positives. There are more positives, so it's a positive result. A negative minus a positive. So if we've got negative 3 minus 7. So we're starting at negative 3. I'm subtracting a positive. When I subtract a positive, I go to the left, right? 5 minus 2, we'd move to the left to get to 3. So even though it's a negative 3 minus a number, we're moving to the left, 7, which is going to bring you all the way to negative 10. Next example. Got negative 11 minus 6. So we start at negative 11. Again, when I subtract a positive, this is not subtracting a negative, subtracting a positive, I'm moving to the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which lands me at negative 17. And last one, negative 5 minus 8. I'm starting at negative 5. I'm subtracting a positive. When I subtract a positive, I go to the left, 8, which is going to land me at negative 13. So let's look at these, making a rule. How do I get to 10 from 7 and 3? Am I going to add or am I going to subtract? Well, I get to 10 by adding. 3 plus 7 brings me to 10. 11 and 6. How do I get to 17? I'm adding to get to 17. And 5 and 8, I'm adding to get to 13. And we're going to talk about how we get these negative results kind of on the next page here. So right now we're just looking at how am I going to get to that absolute value of 10, and we'll talk about why we make them negative